Why is the Myanmar military stepping up attacks on ethnic rebel groups? The UN says almost daily airstrikes on 2 states have killed dozens. Why are calls for a ceasefire being ignored? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Bernard Smith. There's been much attention on the Myanmar military's campaign against the Rohingya, a crackdown on the mainly Muslim minority described by the UN as genocidal. But over the past few weeks, the Myanmar army has stepped up attacks on ethnic armed groups such as the Arakan Army, mainly Buddhist fighters fighting for greater autonomy. Dorsa Jabari reports.
Under attack and forced from their homes in Myanmar, these people had to leave their villages in Rakhine state when fighting intensified between government forces and the ethnic armed group called the Arakan Army.
There was an airstrike. They fired onto our village. Our homes were burned. Artillery shells hit our houses.
Soldiers entered our village and we didn't want to run into them, so we ran away.
Attacks have increased in the northern state over the past 3 weeks and in the western state of Chin. The UN says at least 32 people have died in almost daily airstrikes and shelling in both states, where soldiers are accused of burning down schools and homes. Local reports say 8 people died in an attack on a village on Monday. Myanmar's military commanders rejected the allegations as fake. It's been hard to get clear information on what's happening.
Further complicating the situation, there's been an internet blackout. I believe it's the longest in the world, in 9 townships across Rakhine and Chin states since June 2019. So that's not far off a year now.
The mainly Buddhist Arakan people have been fighting for decades for more autonomy in Rakhine state. That's the same region where the Myanmar army launched a violent crackdown on the mostly Muslim Rohingya minority in 2017. An Arakan Army commander told Al Jazeera last year that their struggle had been overlooked because of the plight of the Rohingya. He referred to the Rohingya as Bengali, a term used by the Myanmar government.
When there are problems with the Bengalis in Rakhine State, the world paid attention and sympathy to them. We want to beg to the world, please look at what's happening with the Arakan people and feel for us too.
Myanmar's military calls the Arakan Army a terrorist organization. It rejected a ceasefire offered this month to deal with the corona pandemic. The peace process with all the ethnic armed groups, led by Myanmar's state councillor Aung San Suu Kyi, has stalled. The government has previously said it'll protect civilians from its military operations. But as the conflict continues, civilians, whether Rakhine or Rohingya, are caught in the middle. Dorsa Jabari for Inside Story.
Let's introduce the panel. In Bangkok, in Thailand, we have Phil Robertson, the Deputy Director of the Asia Division at Human Rights Watch. In the US city of Chicago, Azeem Ibrahim, Director at the Centre for Global Policy and author of The Rohingyas Inside Myanmar's Genocide. And in Johannesburg, in South Africa, Laetitia van den Assum, a member of the Rakhine Advisory Commission and a former ambassador for the Netherlands to the United Kingdom. Welcome to you all. Laetitia, I'd like to begin with you. How much support does the Arakan Army have amongst the Rakhine people?
Oh, they have considerable support. They have considerable support despite all the hardships that they're going through. You see, you have to go back in history and look how the Rakhine people have been marginalized dramatically by the people from the center of Burma, the Bamar, for centuries, and have what was originally a very rich area of what now is called Burma, was in one of the most promising, one of the potentially richest parts of the country. It is now the poorest. So there is, there are long-standing grievances that have not been addressed the commission that I was part of, chaired by Kofi Annan, recognized this and said very clearly that unless the grievances of not only the Rohingya, but also of all the other people of Rakhine State, and notably the Arakan Buddhists, were addressed, that a permanent solution and peace and stability would not be possible.
Phil, those grievances that Laetitia was talking about, why do the Rakhine seem to have lost faith in the political system in Myanmar?
Well, the Rakhine people have traditionally been sort of left aside by many of the discussions with the various different ethnic groups. They have always been considered by the Burmans to be very close to Burmans, and until the Arakan Army really came up, there has not been the kind of systematic, effective ethnic insurgency to challenge that situation. And what we're seeing now is the Myanmar government has classified the Arakan Army as a terrorist organization, which has cut off any possibility of dialogue between the center and the Arakan Army, and in fact is actually even prosecuting various different news site editors for daring to run interviews with Arakan Army spokesperson. So we see a marginalization of the Rakhine and the Rakhine political cause. We see increased human rights violations. We see increased violations of the laws of war by the Burmese military. And this is all creating a great deal of resentment that has fueled support for the Arakan Army.
Azeem, Phil talks about this marginalisation of the Rakhine. I mean, the Arakan National Party won a majority of parliamentary seats in the elections in Rakhine. They believe they should have been able to nominate the state's chief, but Aung San Suu Kyi's party appointed the chief instead. Is that what's provoked this disillusionment and the support for the army, do you think? For the Arakan Army?
I think that has a certain element to play with it, but the reality is that Myanmar has been at war with every single ethnic minority since independence. These are the longest running civil wars in the world. The Arakan Army just happens to be the largest of many of these ethnic groups and probably the most organized. And it seems to me that the Myanmar central authorities are using the cover of the COVID crisis, the coronavirus crisis, to increase their attacks on many of these other minorities. Once they had finished ethnically cleansing the Rohingya from their country, it was only a matter of time before they turned their full attention onto these other minority groups. And it seems that the same military divisions that were deployed to remove the Rohingya, Division 33 and 99, also known as the tip of the spear, are the ones that are leading these attacks against these other minorities. It seems that there are many elements within the Myanmar military who are determined to create a Burma Buddhist nationalist state, and they will not rest until these ethnic minorities have been completely cleansed from their country.
Laetitia, is the Burmese army using COVID as cover? I mean, it's only in January that the ICJ ordered the government to prevent the commission of genocidal acts. I know that was to protect the Rohingya, but violence has continued. The Burmese army doesn't seem to have paid any heed.
The intensification of the more recent violence really started in early February. It was bad before, but it got worse then because the existing internet blackout was extended to larger areas of Rakhine State and also Chin State, and also they started to fight with in a manner that was totally indiscriminate and disproportionate. They started to shell villages, shelling from aircraft, from attack helicopters. Many of those who died were actually civilians, and many amongst them children. And we've been having these reports on a daily basis. The UN has protested. A number of, I think about 18 ambassadors in Yangon, the capital, have asked for a ceasefire. The UN Secretary General has asked for a ceasefire, and the answer that the military of Myanmar has given is just to intensify their fight. They seem to be in a hurry because the rainy season is starting soon, and it will be much more difficult for them to gain ground once the rainy season starts.
And Phil,
it's really intensified. It's under this cloak of darkness of the internet lockdown, but also under the cloak of darkness of the world's attention to COVID and not so much to what is actually happening there. For many people there, I think their fear is more for the military, what the military is doing, than COVID. Part of that is because information to how they can prevent from being infected is not reaching them.
And Phil, you mentioned before that the Arakan Army, it's been designated now by the government in Myanmar as a terrorist group. That's a fashionable term used by many governments these days to crack down on undesirable organisations. Is it going to give them international cover now that they can call them terrorists?
I think that the Myanmar government has very little credibility with the international community at this point. I mean, they've also called the ARSA, which is the Rohingya insurgency, a terrorist group. I think that the government, unfortunately, we have parts of the civilian government that are accomplices to this Burmese military offensive. I mean, it's important to recognize, since, March 23rd, the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights has indicated there's been 32 deaths and 71 people wounded by air raids and bombardment. This is indiscriminate attacks on villages. This is the government and the military, basically trying to, as Laetitia correctly noted, to operate under the cover of darkness with an internet blackout, trying to shut down various different media outlets that dare report on the war in Rakhine State and interview the Arakan Army. And I think what we're moving towards is an implementation of the Myanmar military's traditional 4 cuts policy, which, is an effort to cut off food, funds, intelligence, and recruits from any sort of ethnic insurgency. And what this usually boils down to is attacks on civilians, indiscriminate attacks. And if that's the case, if that's the way we're going in the war against the Arakan Army, there's going to be a lot more deaths and there's going to be a lot more injuries before we're done.
Azeem, do you think designating the Arakan Army a terrorist group is an attempt by Burma's military to give them some sort of cover?
Well, it's clearly an attempt, but as my colleague Phil said, that is probably not going to work. The Myanmar military has now exposed itself as being complicit in a genocidal activity against the largest ethnic minority in the country, which were the Rohingya. The ICJ have ruled against the Myanmar military and the civilian authorities. So we'll only have to wait another month or so to see when the Myanmar authorities have to report back. So they don't really have much credibility. They are quite well recognised as attacking civilians indiscriminately. And as I said earlier, these are some of the longest running civil wars, and the Myanmar military has engaged in atrocities against civilians as part of their strategy. Multiple rape camps, multiple genocides, mass graves, etc. So whether they designate a group a terrorist organization or not will really not have much traction within the international community. It may allow them more flexibility within the home turf in terms of domestic laws to carry out some of these extra kind of judicial activities, including arresting journalists for interviewing leaders of the Arakan Army and the equivalent of the political parties and so on. But I think internationally it'll have very little credibility at all.
And Phil, can I ask you, is the Burmese army, you think, targeting the Rakhine as an ethnic group, as they have done with the Rohingyas? Or are they just trying to crush the army and its supporters? Of course, the Rakhine are mainly Buddhist, while the Rohingyas were predominantly Muslim.
I think increasingly the Tatmadaw is conflating the Rakhine civilians with the Rakhine Arakan Army. I think that, what you're getting is a palpable dislike between the Myanmar army and Rakhine civilians, a feeling that, the Rakhine have very strongly supported the Arakan Army and that they're all in it against the Burma army. And therefore, anything is justified. And I think that what we're concerned about is that we're seeing a change of tactics over the past 6 weeks to 2 months by the Myanmar military, where they are now, shelling villages or launching air attacks that are killing civilians that have nothing to do with the Arakan Army at all.
And Laetitia, can I ask what you think about that? Do you think they're targeting the Rakhine as an ethnic group, considering that they're all Buddhist, or are they targeting them as they were targeting the Rohingyas?
No, I think there is a bit more brotherhood between the Burmans and the and the Rakhine traditionally, but over the past couple of years, once, I think, as Phil indicated, they had dealt with the Rohingya, the Tatmadaw turned on the Rakhine. It is because it's not so much because of the ethnicity, but because they want full control over Rakhine states. And one of the reasons for that is the economic prospects. You have China that is very interested there in developing a corridor to Yunnan province in China, and that leads to a port in Rakhine state. On the other hand, you have India also having similar plans for the port of Sitwe. And, I think the issue of the economic interest should not be forgotten. They're there. And I think, particularly as far as China is concerned, the military is and the government are probably afraid that once the Arakan Army would get a better foothold, they would be able to deal directly and negotiate directly with China and India about future economic development.
OK, I'll come back to China in a second, but Azeem, I wanted to ask you first, how important is the Arakan Army's alliance with other ethnic groups, this northern alliance, particularly the Kachin Independence Army, because they're headquartered up there, the Arakan Army is headquartered up there. How significant is that connection?
I think this alliance is extremely important. I think all of the ethnic minority groups realise that after what happened to the Rohingya, that they are simply next on the list. It was only a question of time before Myanmar's emboldened military turned their attention to these other groups. And so there is an alliance between the various groups, and many of them actually did speak up against the Rohingya genocide whilst that was happening, simply because they knew what was coming to them very soon. The Arakan Army is the largest of all the different various ethnic armies, and it's probably the most organised, which is why they're targeting them specifically. But the Shin, the Karen, the Northern Shan, they're all essentially in the same boat at the moment. The government, they did ask for a ceasefire in April, which was rejected by the military. So that essentially gave the military the green light and the cover of this entire lockdown to try to pursue many of these groups and the leaders of these groups. So I think that's very, very important to know.
Phil, what's this telling us about the relationship between the government and the military in Myanmar? What the military is doing has needed government approval, hasn't it? Are they singing from the same hymn sheet, or are there differences?
Well, under the 2008 Constitution, the Burmese military has a great deal of autonomy in how it operates in issues of national security, which of course they would label what's happening as Rakhine State as a national security issue. But we've not heard any objections from Aung San Suu Kyi or from the ruling National League for Democracy. We have not seen any concerns expressed by the civilian government about what is happening to the internally displaced persons. There's now over 160,000 ethnically displaced displaced ethnic Rakhine people. We've not seen anything from the civilians. So, I think that the civilian government, in some ways, is really an accomplice to this. They are quite concerned that they will lose Rakhine State again in the election that is scheduled to happen in November 2020. That the Rakhine will be, again, voting for an ethnic party over the National League for Democracy. And I think that therefore, they are, looking the other way as the Burmese military does its work against civilians in Rakhine State.
Laetitia, do you see that the government is an accomplice to what the military is doing in Rakhine State?
It is. An internet blackout cannot take place without the Ministry of Communications instructing, the providers to cut down in a certain area. The declaration of the Arakan Army as a terrorist organization required the approval of the president. So, the issue is also that even though over the last couple of weeks, Aung San Suu Kyi has gone on paper instructing everyone in the government and in the army not to do anything that would continue the genocide which has been taking place in Rakhine State against the Rohingya for a long time. In effect, what is happening on the ground is very much a continuation of that genocide. Let's be clear. I mean, all Rakhine's people are suffering at the moment. Just last week, an excellent report came out by the Independent Rakhine Initiative, which looks at freedom of movement for the people of Rakhine State. It clearly sketches that the situation for the Rohingya is worse, but it also shows that since late 2018, all the other people in Rakhine State who suffer very similar fates. It is becoming very similar to what's been happening to the Rohingya for decades.
OK. And Azeem, I'd just like to touch on China, if I may. There's been significant Chinese investment in Rakhine State, but it's got a deep-sea port, it's got a pipeline, a gas pipeline. But this 27 government-backed commission that Laetitia was on, in fact, reported that the profits were going to China and to the central government. They weren't being enjoyed by the people in Rakhine State. What influence could China have over this? Is it interested in having influence over this?
Well, this is the characteristic of China's Belt and Road project, is that China uses its own labourers, it's using its own finance, and the local communities benefit very little from any sort of Chinese investment. This is just part and parcel of how they actually operate. China has much larger goals than just economic within the region. Access to Myanmar gives it access to the Indian Ocean and the Bay of Bengal, and they can thus surround their nuclear rival, India. China has ambitions to be a global superpower, but before it can become a global superpower, it must become a regional power, and that means keeping its nuclear rival, India, in check, and they can avoid the Straits of Malacca and have access to the Indian Ocean. So Myanmar is a geopolitically very strategic location for China to have access to. So there's much more to the calculations than just economic benefit.
Phil, is it in China's interests to try and influence what's going on in Rakhine at the moment, to try and bring stabilisation there, considering the importance of the area to it?
I think that China does have an interest in seeing some degree of stability. But on the other hand, they also have a very tenuous relationship with the Burmese military. It's important to recall that China is also the key backer of some of these Northern Alliance groups, particularly the United Wa State Army, which is a group that controls a huge swath of Burmese land in Burma on the China border. And so China is playing it both ways. They're in some ways trying to entice cooperation, but they're also willing to use proxies to pressure the government for cooperation. I think ultimately, they've said that they're going to try to solve the Rohingya problem as well, trying to get the Rohingya to come back. They're trying to broker some sort of deal between Myanmar and Bangladesh. Nothing has really happened on that. And I think also they want to be seen as the brokers to try to involve in trying to create some stability, particularly in the areas where their pipeline is currently placed through Jokpyu and going up out of Rakhine State.
All right, OK. We are unfortunately out of time, so we'll have to leave it there for the moment. But I'd like to say thanks to all our guests, Phil Robertson, Azeem, Ibrahim and Laetitia van den Assum. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Bernard Smith, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.